Hi, this is Maria Williams. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create these cards in two different ways, one with watercolor paper and watercolor pencils, and the other one by using strips of cardstock. The dies that I'm using today are the Bold Butterfly and the Butterfly Thinless dies from Stampin' Up! And they are going to be retired on May 31st, so if you don't have them and you want them, you might want to go ahead and order them now. I'm also using the Celebrate You Thinless dies, and the stamp set that I'm going to use is the Sunshine Sayings stamp set. There's a sentiment that says "So happy for you," and I'm going to use the "So happy for" portion of it for my sentiments. I'm going to show you the watercolor version of the card first. So I'm using a craft sheet, and I have cut some pieces of watercolor paper to 4 inches. Actually, these are longer than 4 inches. They're probably about 5.5 inches long by 7/8 of an inch tall. And the 6 pieces together with 7/8 inches in width will give me a total of about 5 1/4, which is 1/4 inch smaller than the height of my card. So I'm going to end up with a panel that is 5 1/4 by 4 inches. I've selected my watercolor pencils in rainbow order, which is Roygbiv. That's how I can remember it now. Roygbiv. So R for red, but I am using Mellow Mambo for that. Orange, which I'm using Pumpkin Pie for. Yellow, which is Daffodil Delight. Green, which is Old Olive. Blue, which I'm using Bermuda Bay for. I'm skipping the indigo color, and for the violet, I'm using Rich Razzleberry. I'm starting with the Mellow Mambo watercolor pencil, and all I'm doing is I'm scribbling on the watercolor paper, and then I'm going to apply a pretty good amount of water. I want to make sure that I have enough water to saturate the top of the paper so that the color moves around freely. When you scribble onto the watercolor paper, you want to make sure that you don't press too hard, because if you press too hard, it's going to the color is going to really embed into the watercolor paper, and then when you put the water on it, it may not smooth out. So you may end up with some harsh lines, which is not really the look that we're going for. It doesn't really matter whether you apply the color in circles or in lines, just make sure that you use a light touch. In between colors, I'm just going to use a rag, and I'm going to squeeze some of the water out of the water brush and brush it a little bit back and forth onto my rag, and that will get off all the color from the tip. And then I can move on to the next color. Just in case you don't get enough color on your piece of watercolor paper on the first application, I'm going to show you 3 different ways that you can add a little bit more. One of them is to take the tip of the water brush directly to the watercolor pencil and pick up a little bit of color that way, and then apply it to the watercolor paper. Another way is, even after the paper is wet, is to take your watercolor pencil and scribble some more over the wet area. You have to be pretty careful with this. You don't, again, want to press too hard and create any harsh lines. Then you can once again take your aqua painter and add a little bit more water and blend it all out. And finally, a third way is to take a scrap of watercolor paper and scribble, and you can do this pretty hard, scribble some of the watercolor pencil onto that, add a lot of water, and then pick up that color that is mixed with the water and apply it onto the watercolor paper that you're working on. The thing to know here is that the mix that you have on the extra piece of watercolor paper will dry fairly quickly, and once it dries, it's not going to move. That's one thing that's different about watercolor pencil than watercolors, is that watercolors can be reactivated after they have dried, whereas the watercolor pencils, once they have mixed with water and dried, they cannot be reactivated again. So you can see that in this particular example, I had to scribble the Pear Pizzazz watercolor pencil twice onto the scrap in order to get enough color. Now that I have all my background strips done, I'm going to move on to watercoloring another piece of watercolor paper with the Island Indigo ink pad. I don't know if you remember, but I skipped the indigo part of the rainbow, and I'm going to incorporate it in the sentiment. I don't have an Island Indigo watercolor pencil, so that's why I'm using the pad. So I'm just squeezing it to get some ink on the lid. And then I'm just going to use the same aqua painter to add some water and very quickly and liberally apply the wash onto the watercolor paper. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to clean my mat a little bit and set everything aside to dry. In the meantime, I'm going to show you how I assembled the background that I made with the cardstock strip. The key to making these backgrounds really sturdy and easy to assemble is to use these wonderful adhesive sheets. So I'm going to peel the backing on one of the sides of the adhesive. Now notice that the edge of the adhesive sheet is not really clean when you peel off the backer. Sometimes some of the glue comes away with the backer, and so I don't like to place my cardstock right on the edge of where I peeled off the backing. So I'm just giving myself a little bit of leeway all the way around. Then I'm going to take a piece of white, thick white cardstock that I have cut to 4 inches by 5¼ inches, and I'm going to place it onto the adhesive. Then I'm going to put the backer back down and burnish everything really well with a bone folder, and using some scissors I'm going to trim around the cardstock. If you can see your cardstock through the backer, that's great that you can trim around it this way, but sometimes you'll have to actually peel up the backing so that you can see exactly where you need to trim. And I will warn you that your scissors are going to get a fair amount of stickiness on them. Some of the adhesive sheet will come off onto your scissors, but I will show you later how to clean that. Once I have trimmed all the excess adhesive sheet, I'm going to remove the other layer of backer paper from the adhesive sheet and very carefully apply my strips. It is key that I place the first one right along the edge so that my strips are perfectly lined up. There will be some glue along the edges of the cardstock, so if you want to protect your surface, you can use a craft sheet, or as I'm using here, a silicone mat. I'm just going to keep aligning the strips, and it is important that they are really tight, close up against each other. You really don't want to have any gaps. So I'm going to place the last couple of strips, and then I can just use some regular scissors, flip the piece around the back, and trim off the excess pieces of cardstock. You could really use this background as it is once all the extra pieces are trimmed, but we are going to go that step further and apply some glitter. To do that, I'm going to take the adhesive sheet and apply it to the stripes, and once again trim around it with scissors. And then I'm just going to take a coffee filter and some dazzling diamonds and peel off half of the backing, apply the glitter liberally, and then rub it in with my finger. When you do this, the key is to not rub your finger over the parts that have exposed adhesive. You want to make sure that you're rubbing the glitter onto the adhesive sheet. And when you're done and you shake off the excess, and you can even use a small paintbrush to help you get the excess off, it has almost like a velvety feeling, and the glitter really shouldn't fall off anymore. Only what is really stuck onto the adhesive sheet should remain on there. Then I peel off the remaining backer and do the same thing for the other half of my panel. And as you can see, just that easily, you end up with a piece of cardstock that is completely covered in glitter and that is really sparkly. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is all the die cutting, and I'm cutting the detailed butterflies out of thick white cardstock so that they're nice and sturdy. And then I'm going to cut the outlines of the same butterflies out of vellum, because I'm going to layer the white cardstock over vellum so that I get a little bit more muted color behind the butterfly. To easily remove the chads from the detail butterflies, I am using the Big Shot die brush and the foam pad that it comes with. And as you can see, it removes the vast majority of the chads, and then I just have to remove the few that are remaining. While I have the big shot out, I'm going to go ahead and cut the U sentiment as well. And I didn't mention before, but I did go ahead and cut all three butterflies and out of the white cardstock, the vellum, and the three U's out of the watercolored paper. Once my watercolored strips were dry, I went ahead and covered another 4" by 5¼ inch piece of thick white cardstock with the adhesive sheet and peeled off the backer and applied the watercolor strips in the same order as I did the cardstock strip. I then applied the adhesive sheet to the striped side of the cardstock just like I did before and applied the dazzling diamonds half a sheet at a time so that I would have a good area to hold on to while I applied the glitter. I did the same thing with the other panel that is a horizontal panel, and those strips are cut to 11/18 of an inch. And I know that that's kind of a tricky measurement, but that is what you need in order to end up with a panel that is 4¼ inches tall. And if you look at the comparison of the three panels, you can see why I bothered watercoloring the strips. You get a totally different look, it's a lot lighter, and you get a little bit more texture. The last piece of the card that needs to be done is the sentiment. And as I mentioned before, this is the stamp that I used. I went ahead and cut it because I expect that I'm going to be using it without the U many more times. And I can always piece it back together on the block when I want to use the full sentiment. And I'm going to be using the 1¾ and the 2" circle punches. I'm using Island Indigo ink to stamp the sentiment since that would be the 7th color from the rainbow. And then with the 1¾ inch punch, I'm going to punch a circle out of some thick white cardstock. And I'm going to glue the sentiment, once I trim it out a little bit, onto the back of the white cardstock. Then I'm going to take a square of the adhesive sheet and I'm going to glue that onto the back of the vellum and to the white cardstock. I want to make sure that it overhangs the circle. I'm going to burnish it down really well to make sure that when I peel it off later, it's going to really be adhered to the back of the vellum and to the cardstock. Next, I'm going to take the 2" circle punch and I'm going to line it up with the smaller circle that I've already cut and punch it out. And here's a bit of a disclaimer. It did take a little bit of pressure to punch this out, and the manufacturer probably doesn't recommend that you do these many layers, but I had no trouble punching it out and it punched out cleanly. To finish the sentiment off, I'm just going to take one of the U sentiments and I'm going to glue it down with a little bit of multi-purpose adhesive. So now the fun part of assembling the card. I had already made one, so I already knew exactly where my elements were going. And here, as you can see, I'm just peeling off the backer of the adhesive sheet, and you will not be able to tell at all that there's any kind of adhesive behind that vellum on the sentiment. I did try using liquid glue on the edge of the cardstock, and that really didn't work out well. You really need something very strong because you are gluing onto glitter. For the butterflies, I used small pieces of dimensionals. The edges of the dimensional sheets are great for this. And that basically completed my card. I then just took a standard card base and used some tear tape. Again, you want to use something that is sturdy because you've got basically 2 layers of cardstock plus your embellishments. So you want to use a strong adhesive. So I used tear and tape. For 2 of the cards, I decided to do the sentiment in a slightly simpler way. So I simply stamped the sentiment onto Whisper White cardstock and trimmed out the So Happy 4 just with some small scissors and applied some dimensionals onto the back of it and glued it directly onto the card. And then I also applied some very small pieces of dimensionals onto the U and glued it directly to the card. I'm not sure which sentiment I like better. This one's a little bit simpler and it uses fewer supplies, so that is always a plus. Last but not least, I finished off the horizontal card, and I realized when I was arranging the elements that the U got lost in the blue section of the card, and so I decided to flip it over. By then, unfortunately, I had already glued it to my card base. So off camera, I unglued it and very carefully put it back on the other way around. Before I finish the video, here's my tip about cleaning your scissors. So your scissors might look something like this when you are done. So peel off any pieces of paper, any bits of adhesive that you can just peel off with your fingers. And then, as you can see, this isn't coming off with my fingers at all. It doesn't want to budge. But if you use an adhesive eraser, adhesive remover, I know that they sell different kinds with slightly different names. You just rub it along the blade, and you can see it already starts taking it off. So just keep working it, preferably toward the edge of the blade, and most of it will come off. And then when you've gotten a lot of it off, grab some rubbing alcohol. It doesn't have to be the higher grade. Regular rubbing alcohol will work with a rag or cotton balls, and rub it along the edge of the scissors, and that will take most of it off. And then go back one more time with the adhesive remover, and then one more time with the alcohol, and your scissors should be nice and clean. So that's it for the cards. Here is another look at all of them. This is the original one that I did before I filmed the video with the watercolor strips. Here's the second one with the watercolor strips, but the simpler sentiment. Here is the landscape card with the cardstock strips, and here's the other card with the cardstock strips. I really love the way these cards turned out. I love the glittery background. I don't often make such feminine cards, so leave me a comment and let me know which one you like best. Thank you so much for joining me today.